Class, MASH. By Anutty. Chapter 241, Updates. MASH closed his eyes and leaned his head back against a nearby tree. Sitting in the snow probably wasn't the best idea, but it didn't really matter. His clothes were still drenched in blood. A little bit of snow wouldn't make a difference. He focused inward and checked his status. Name, MASH Stell Lumber. Class, Chimeric Vagabond. Level, 102-108. Health, 3300/3300. Energy, 4400/4400. Fortitude, 308 plus 22 330. Endurance, 186 plus 14 210. Strength, 255 plus 275. Agility, 260 plus 275. Intelligence, 221 plus 230. Wisdom, 110. Charisma, 100. Free stats, 2080. Skills, Hunt, Thunderwood Creation, Inhuman Hibernation, Chimeric Transformation, Thunderwood Imitation, Chimeric Reconstruction, Vagabond's Path, Chimeric Domain, Adaptable Monster Core, Chimera's Constitution, Wooden Body, Mimics Avarice, A Touch of Nothingness, Golden Body. Chimeric Domain, passive. Your eyes just weren't enough. Sense the changes in the mana around you. Connect to the mana and life in your space and inherently understand the nature of the mana and life. Your presence suffuses the space, weakens the magic and strength of enemies beneath you. They cower beneath your might. Current range, 53-57 feet. Golden Body, passive. Having stolen the techniques of another world, your body evolves beyond its old limitations. However, even this transformation is incomplete. Seek out the next step and truly make this power your own. Trial of the True Body, 822/100. MASH took a few minutes to allocate his stats. He preferred going in groups of 10 as he saw them as artificial walls. If he could surpass them, he typically tried to do just that. He considered raising his wisdom or charisma to balance his stats but decided against it. They would raise naturally, and he might get a skill like Luke to naturally equalize it with some of his other stats. That was what he told himself as he further increased his physical abilities. The permanent bonuses he got from eating the creatures were more significant than he expected. He had mostly eaten small wolves, though he did eat what he could from the largest wolves. Jill had managed to kill the other pack leader without doing too much damage to it. Even still, the thing he was most excited to see was how much he had progressed his golden body. It had seemed like something that would take a long time to accomplish, but it seemed like monsters at this level were helping him make a lot of progress. That was good, as they planned to spend a few days here. He wasn't sure if he could complete the trial, but it felt doable. Something entered his domain, causing him to jump to his feet. It had mana, but he was more curious because of the shape that was approaching him. It was distinctly humanoid but definitely not human. MASH's sudden motion had alerted the others and they stared in the same direction he looked. There was nothing there, well, at least nothing they could see. The only reason he could track the person's movements was because of his domain. The person was wearing thick robes and traveled swiftly, using the surrounding trees to obscure her approach. The thick robes made it a little hard to tell if the person was human. They were obviously made of wolf fur, and they had even fashioned something like a mask to cover their face. The covering was also magical and obscured him from looking beneath it. It was like the hero's armor from the tournament. He didn't really understand what caused the effect, but he didn't try to pry further with his domain. The person was already in earshot, and he could easily call out to them. He hesitated though and told Priscilla to send messages to the others. Hopefully one of them would say something first. Whoever this person was, they were skilled. Their movements were silent, and they were obviously strong enough to hunt the wolves. The fur on them was enough to prove that much. Another few seconds of silence had passed, and he decided to speak first. "Hi, adventurer? Look, we don't want any trouble. We just want to hunt monsters." MASH was thinking about what else to say and glanced at Red. He was hoping she would have something to add. She seemed to understand, and blessedly continued where he left off. "We are adventurers. I am Red, and the one who found you is MASH. Who are you, and what do you want?" Red wasn't exactly trying to be friendly. Her words cut straight to the main point and sounded more like a demand than a conversation. It made him wince a little at the blunt tone. Although it was understandable that she would be so forward. Almost every problem they had with others occurred when they weren't completely straightforward. Mash continued to watch the person in question. They had paused upon the request, and just stood unmoving. It kind of felt like they assumed that he wouldn't be able to track them if they stayed still. That was pretty dumb, and he was going to point it out. The person moved first, and he paused his comment. They stepped into view, both their hands raised in the air. It was a placating gesture to try and seem harmless. It didn't affect them in the slightest. They were alert, and a simple gesture like that was not enough to get them to relax. Honestly, he doubted that there was anything the person could do to appease their concern. Plus, they were wearing a wolf head mask of some kind. It was connected to a coat that was made entirely of the monster fur. He didn't see any openings in the mask and wondered if the person could see things. "Hello, I'm Sarah. I'm AAA, not an adventurer. An alchemist. That's what I am." Mash noticed a few things instantly. The speaker was female, and probably a human of some kind. Her voice was high-pitched, but that might be due to her obvious fear. The way she spoke made that kind of obvious. The other thing he guessed was that she wasn't very smart and was most likely lying. It was a poor attempt at a lie too. Her sentence was broken awkwardly, and it sounded like she was trying to correct herself for no reason. He thought that he could have done a better job. Probably not, he wasn't particularly good at lying either. "Are you human?" Red oddly didn't seem to doubt Sarah's words, and Mash could practically see the girl sigh in relief despite the mask. For his part, he was trying to figure out what Red was thinking. There was no chance she believed any of this right. He froze, and passed glances to the others, trying to figure out what was happening. Was Red playing along? That was reasonable. He guessed that it would help the girl relax. The girl did seem to relax a lot and started nodding her head. From beneath the cloak of fur, she brought out distinctly human hands and reached the mask's nose. She grabbed it and yanked the nose upwards. The head came off like a hood, and he realized that was probably the intention. The girl beneath didn't match with the voice or clothes. She was not old exactly but was a lot older than him. Probably closer to his brother but might even be a year or two older than him. She had short blonde hair that was cut down to look more like a boy's hairstyle. It was probably because of her strange choice of headwear. Despite her strange choices, she was quite pretty. Enough so that he wouldn't find it hard to believe that she was a member of some noble house or something. I am human. I'm not looking for a fight. I just wanted to be by some of the corpses. I have money." The more she spoke, the more suspicious she sounded. It was like talking to a bad actor. Mash didn't want to deal with this. Honestly, all he wanted to do was fight with monsters and spend some time with his friends. He had come here hoping to avoid this exact situation. He let out an involuntary sigh which made the girl jump a little. She was really scared for some reason. "Why are you so scared?" Mash wondered if she was being hunted, or maybe some other type of monster. He hoped for the latter a little. Any new monsters would be useful. The girl's next words were significantly more disappointing. "No. I mean, I am a little scared, but not of the monsters." She gave him some very pointed looks, and he knew. She was scared of him. Another sigh escaped his lips, and he decided to just leave the conversation to the others. The fear in her eyes made sense now, and he was even more annoyed by the conversation. Jill took the opportunity and asked a more pointed question. "How long were you watching us?" Jill's sudden question caused the girl to flinch. She swung her head quickly as she tried to find who had spoken. Jill hadn't been hiding or anything, she was just slightly off to the right of the girl. Mash listened to the conversation but began working on the 2 wolves he had set aside for dinner. It would take a while to clean and cut the meat, and he was getting hungry. Well, he was always hungry. I saw him eat the pack leader live. She sounded even more frightened now, and Mash froze mid-motion. He had formed a wooden blade in one of his hands and had made enchantments for sharpness. It was like a butcher's knife, and he was easily cutting through the wolf's flesh. He had stopped and glanced at the frightened lady. He briefly debated what to do next, but just continued butchering the monster. Hunger won out against a stranger's impression of him. He felt Red's stare bore into the back of his head and ignored it. "Anything other than the ones he's working on are free game. Give us what you think it's worth. And don't worry about Mash, he just gets hungry. Very hungry." Jill had taken the lead and started selling the wolf corpses. She was getting rid of everything. Whether this girl was lying or not, she did have gold and was going to stick to her word. They were still within the range of her domain, and he could see her constantly glancing at him. It was pretty obvious. She was extremely worried about his actions. He couldn't help but try and remember what he had looked like when he fought with the wolf. His clothes were still covered in blood from the fight. With his poor joke and the preceding awkwardness, he had forgotten to clean himself up. There was a lot of blood on his body. He had eaten the wolf quite happily, and he might have even grinned during the fight. With a little help from Priscilla, he was able to recreate an image of the moment. He paused once they had finished reconstructing the memory. Yet, he had been pretty horrific. In fact, he had definitely seemed more like a monster than a human. Sarah might have followed in hopes of finding the remains of a monster. If she was really here to collect corpses, that would have been a good strategy. He thought about what someone like this girl would be doing here. It was a high-level area with plenty of monsters. He was sure that other adventurers and people would come by too. People over level 100 didn't have many options for leveling. If she was here for a while, then she should have accrued quite the horde of monster corpses and the like. He realized what Sarah was. He didn't let it affect his expression or what he was doing but had Priscilla send the information to the others. She's a corpse scavenger. Chapter 242, A Scavenger's Wares. Mash knew a little bit about scavengers. Ironically, it was this group that gave the runner class a bad reputation. They did as their name implied and scavenged for dead adventurers. They would pilfer their corpses and grab any items that they could. Almost all of their skills would be based on stealth and escape. Hence the association with cowardice. Runners typically ended up as scavengers, porters, or rogues. All of which had small variations in skills, but none of which were treated very well. The classes weren't exactly strong or respected either. It didn't matter much to them. Rather, the information made them more interested in the girl. They didn't trust the girl or anything like that, but a good scavenger would hoard many magical items. Their strength was usually related to items they pilfered. Since Sarah was in a high-level area, she probably had a handful of interesting things. Mash wanted to see what she had, maybe even buy some things. With the way his skills worked, he didn't really know what kind of item he wanted. There were only a few places left where he could put them, but he wanted to make sure the rest of the items he got were actually useful, like the storage space and translation bracelet. His healing necklace had become quite useless. It had improved a little with his growth, but it wasn't really keeping up with his health. At least it was useful when he got it. He waited though and just continued making dinner while Jill finished selling the corpses. While continuing with the dinner preparations, he had Priscilla send a few messages to Jill. He basically just told her to find out if Sarah had any items to sell, and maybe try and build a good rapport or something. Mash was planning on hunting a lot of monsters, and having someone who would take care of the corpses was useful. Even if all she did was handle the selling of the items and corpses they found, it would make things a lot simpler. Jill was probably thinking something along the same lines. Mash wasn't making anything complicated. He made a stew from the wolves, using basically all of the meat and bones in their bodies in the stew. It made for a lot of stew, but he knew that he could eat any amount. He also made some rice. It was a grain that he had picked up when in town. Interestingly enough, it was Edward who was growing the new grain. He was working with his people and Arthur to create some consistent work for his people. Mash had a few dishes with the grain while he was with his brother, and just liked the general flavor of it. It was a great alternative for bread. He knew that Luke still preferred bread and took out some rolls for him. After finishing with the setup, all that was left was waiting for the stew to finish. Mash had only partially been listening to the conversation with Jill but had heard her invite the scavenger to join them for their dinner. Sarah agreed reluctantly, drawn by the delicious smells coming from the large pot. Currently, they were all seated around the pot, and Sarah had decided to wear her mask again. It was odd to speak to someone with a wolf's head over their face. He decided to ask anyway. His curiosity had reached its tipping point. He waited for a break in the conversation and interjected himself into it. "Hey, you're a scavenger, right? Do you have any items for sale?" Jill and Red didn't seem very happy with his direct approach. He didn't really want to wait. Plus, he didn't want to have to deal with the awkwardness of trying to talk around the subject. It would be better to get it out there and reveal his lack of bias. He didn't care much for what she chose to do with her life. A scavenger was necessary whether people liked to admit it or not. They were often the only ones to find out if an adventurer died somewhere, whether that was in or out of a dungeon. Although, it was rarer to find them inside dungeons. The question wasn't exactly well received, and Mash could tell that the girl was growing tense. She probably hadn't expected them to figure out what she was, but she didn't try and run or anything. How did you know? The way she stuttered every time she spoke made him think that it was not because of fear, but just how she was normally. He answered, without turning his head away from the pot of stew. He wasn't skilled enough to look away from what he was cooking. Plus, it was a dish that required him to stir regularly, otherwise, the stuff at the bottom would burn. It's pretty obvious. I am serious about buying things though. I don't really care either, my first class was a runner. We have a lot of gold. He was trying to be as blunt as possible, deciding to take a page from Red's book earlier. He couldn't see her expression, but she was definitely surprised to hear that he was once a runner. The mention of gold seemed to get a reaction from her too, and she shifted a little in her seat. It seemed like she had grown a little more eager too, and she spoke quickly. Oh okay, I have plenty of goods. Here. Mash was not prepared for what was coming, but he felt the shift in mana around her. Priscilla. Warn the others. It might have been paranoid, but he didn't like the sudden use of mana. It was a considerable amount too, and he turned away from the stew to see what was happening. The air around Sarah was shimmering, and shapes started to form around her. The lights turned into tables, and he noticed the shapes of items forming on them. The lights bent around them and any objects in the space, and he realized that it was like a mirage. Was it a shop? Yes, that was exactly what was being made around him. It was a skill that presented what items she possessed in a phantom shop. It was probably to stop people from stealing things. The skill was interesting, and he got up to take a look around. He made an imitation of Priscilla and had it continue to stir the stew though. She did it, but he got what felt like offense for being assigned such a meaningless task. It wasn't like it was a difficult task, and she had the ability to multitask too. Was it a matter of pride? If it was probably a human habit that she had picked up from him. He ignored her pestering and moved on to look at the items. There were a lot laid out, and he was rather impressed with the hoard. He walked toward one of the mirages and touched the table. It looked like it was made of wood, but it bent around his hand. What is this place? Luke asked the question while he stepped into what seemed to be a suit of armor. The metal armor was made of many jagged pieces, and Luke was able to step into the mirage. He turned and acted like he was wearing the armor. It was a childish gesture, but Mash was doing the same. His hands were around a sword's handle. Even if he couldn't actually touch the item, he was able to get an idea of what the item was like and how it would fit him. He would never get a sword though, even if the blade was extremely beautiful. It was long and slightly curved. The whole blade was black, and small lines of blue revered through the metal. He stared at it for a moment longer but moved on when Sarah started speaking. This is called a DD Dream Vault. Its SS stops people from SS stealing from me. Hearing her speak was always a little odd. Mash wasn't sure if she was telling the truth, or if she was just trying to protect herself. Not that he would kill her for a couple of items either way. He didn't think she was scared anymore, but her stuttering made him unsure. He decided he would just assume that she wasn't. Luke nodded to Sarah and stepped out of the strange mirage. It blurred around him. Jill, who had been exploring another table, pointed at something on the table. Mash couldn't tell what it was with his domain. It all just looked like some mana that had been shaped to resemble items. Judging from the shape, he thought that they were earrings, but he wasn't certain. Hey, what do these do? Jill stared at the jewelry, and Mash walked over to see what she had found. It was only a single earring, and it was complicated. She would definitely need more piercings to fit them all. It was an attractive piece with 3 separate piercings in the form of studs and a thin metal chain connecting them all. The metal was black and there were different colored gems in the center of each stud, red at the top then green and blue afterward. It didn't look like something Jill would normally wear. It had a certain edginess to it, like something a rogue would wear. Mash kept his mouth closed and made no comment as Sarah explained. It stops mind magic. Also helps you remember things. Most older adventurers have them. Those above 150. I mean. Her explanation was lackluster, but it was something he had never seriously considered. He was close to becoming an immortal. Everyone was close. He never considered that memory could become an issue if he lived long enough. It probably wouldn't become a problem anytime soon. That didn't mean it was something he shouldn't consider. He did have Priscilla though, and she seemed to have perfect memory despite her age. Priscilla wasn't sure if her memory would be perfect forever, but it had yet to be a concern. That was good enough for the moment. How much? Jill asked the question, which surprised Mash a little. He didn't think she would buy something so quickly. Her eagerness was evident though, and Sarah tried taking advantage of that. It didn't work though. Jill was still a merchant daughter and haggled with the best of them. Even after the back and forth and the price coming down by almost 20%, she still paid a little over 1,000 gold for the item. It was a lot for a rather simple item, but she probably knew better than him. After their transaction, Red also purchased an item. She didn't buy an attuned item but purchased a unique messaging item. It was a pair of two glass birds that were linked to one another. One was blue and the other red. It wasn't as good as Priscilla's memory but would repeat spoken words. There was a delay based on distance as well, but she said it would be good enough. It would be better than trying to send letters. Mash asked her about it and learned that she planned on giving it to her mother. He didn't think this was the time for that. A complete stranger was standing not too far away. Mash continued to look through the items. There were a lot of unique items, and he didn't really find anything easily. Priscilla noticed something, and he walked over to what she had seen. Chapter 243, Crunch. Mash walked through the horde of items, momentarily forgetting about everything as Priscilla drew his attention to something interesting. It was an egg. One that was as big as his hand with an interesting pattern over the top of it. The mirage effect made it hard to understand what exactly he was looking at. It almost looked like the strange egg was cracked but it didn't feel delicate. He couldn't help but ask about the strange sight. What is it? Despite speaking aloud, he wanted a response from both Priscilla and Sarah. Priscilla had drawn his attention to the egg, so he assumed that she must have felt something from it. On the other hand, he hoped that Sarah would be willing to share what she knew. He would probably buy the egg regardless of what they said though. His desire to eat the egg was growing, if for nothing else than the chance at a new form. Sarah kind of just phased into being across from Mash. She wasn't actually there. His domain let him see the illusion for what it was. Despite this being the first time she used a skill just to speak to someone, he waited patiently for her answer. The strange egg was far more interesting to him than her excessive caution. Her illusion was able to speak, and she explained what the egg was. Well, she shared what she knew about the egg. It was a DDD dungeon reward. I don't know. The AA adventure I got it off DD died. Luckily, he made it out of the DD dungeon. FF for me, I am mean. She definitely had more trouble when she talked to him, but she managed to get everything across. He was able to get the general meaning of her message. Was he getting used to her panicked words? Sadly, his understanding didn't mean that she had more to share. She knew nothing about the item other than where it was from. There was an obvious contradiction in her story. She knew that the item was a dungeon reward, but claimed she got it off an adventurer outside of the dungeon. That didn't make any sense. She shouldn't know that it was a dungeon reward in that case. Deciding not to point it out, he listened to Priscilla's input. It's a beast egg. Even its egg holds mana and a large amount of it. You should gain something by consuming it. Mash was getting excited, Persicla's words evoking his childish desire for something new. He couldn't stop himself from smiling and he asked for a price. She shivered in response to his sudden smile, but he just kept at it. How much? Sarah froze, and the others also turned to see what he had found. They saw the egg on the table and could guess what his plan was. Jill was about to say something but was cut off as Sarah named a price. It seemed like she didn't want to let Jill get involved with the sale. Jill had managed to get huge discounts on all the items that had been purchased thus far, and Sarah had grown tired of it. 2,500 G gold. She said the number without stuttering. It was probably something she had practiced. He didn't hesitate to open his storage space, and quickly grabbed the bag of gold coins from his storage space. He had enough gold to pay her for the egg. Thankfully his brother had forced him to take more gold with him. He seemed to believe that Mash would cause a problem and gave him enough gold to appease even a noble. That meant that Mash was currently in possession of 4,000 gold coins. It was more than enough to pay for the mysterious egg. He tossed the bag over to the real Sarah. She was startled, surprised that he could find her so easily. Without hesitation, he reached for the egg. The mirage had solidified into reality once they had paid for the item, and he bet the same thing would happen now. The egg was large enough that he had to use his whole hand to pick it up. As soon as he got his fingers around the egg, it became solid. It felt like coarse stone beneath his fingers. The cracks along the egg's surface were definitely a part of the egg's design. Mash felt the mana and it was thick, and it smelled oddly sweet. He found himself salivating, and he had to swallow a few times to get back in control. As promised, he gave the others a small heads up. Well, he had Priscilla send a message to the others and gave Luke some extra details. Mash didn't think he would need a healer, but it was better to be careful. Thank you. Sarah was watching him. She was curious to see what he was going to do with the egg. He felt her gaze on him and decided to thank her. There was no reason to be rude. After all, she had been the one to sell him such a nice gift. Her curiosity turned to horror, as Mash lifted the egg to his mouth. He took a bite, altering his teeth so that they would be strong enough to bite the egg. The egg was large, and he altered his face shape to fit the entire thing in his mouth. Mash slammed his mouth shut. It was difficult to do. The egg was harder than he expected it to be. He managed it though. Sarah doubled over and vomited, the noise was too much for her. He wasn't surprised and almost joined her. First, there had been a breaking noise as his teeth broke past the outer shell. It was followed by a soft squishing noise as he pierced what was within. The sound was not of biting into an egg, but into an animal. The sound of meat tearing was quickly accompanied by bones crunching. All of the noise echoed within his head, but he knew that some of the others could hear it too. That first bite had been disturbingly loud. Jill was close enough to hear and she joined Sarah in her disgust. She didn't vomit but she raised her hands to cover her ears, and she blinked away. Red and Luke were spared some of the sounds, but it still wasn't a pleasant sight. Blood and slime drooped from his overfull mouth. He continued to chew, but it was hard. The sweet smell had been a complete lie. This was by far one of the most disgusting things he had ever eaten. It wasn't the taste that bothered him. He couldn't even really focus on the taste, as the awful textures danced across his tongue. It was a mix of slimy egg and meat, with small pieces of bone and shell. He really shouldn't have popped the whole thing in his mouth, and he almost puked as something hard brushed against his throat. Priscilla grew wood over his mouth, forcing him to swallow the food. Don't waste something so valuable. Her words felt hollow initially. The texture made him want to spit, but the wood was in the way. It forced him to reach what was in his mouth. The second time around was even worse than the first. He felt it though, the sudden boost in his stats that was even greater than the pack leader. Whatever this creature was, it was strong. He bore with the texture and just started swallowing as much as he could. Even if it wasn't properly chewed. Even if bits of egg and bone scratched his throat, he didn't stop. Not until his mouth was empty. Once he succeeded, he started forming a lot of water. On top of letting the water fall on him, he held his mouth open to wash out the memory. He needed to forget about that awful texture. He wanted to check his status, to try his new form. Instead of doing any of that, he sat down and took a few deep breaths. The experience wouldn't leave his mouth. The water only helped deal with the leftovers, but it did nothing for the memory. The egg had been way more developed than he expected. He should have checked it first. There were people out there that raised powerful beasts to fight alongside them. No, that was never the plan. Mash already had Priscilla and didn't really want to deal with more. Plus, gaining forms and stats were more valuable and provided a much more definite return. Even if the experience itself would haunt him, he was able to distract himself quite easily. He focused inward and figured out what exactly he had gained from the monster. Name, Mash Stell Lumber Class, Chimeric Vagabond. Level, 108. Health, 3300/3300. Energy, 4400/4400. Fortitude, 330. Endurance, 210. Strength, 275. Agility, 275. Intelligence, 230. Wisdom, 110/120. Charisma, 100/110. Golden Body, passive. Having stolen the techniques of another world, your body evolves beyond its old limitations. However, even this transformation is incomplete. Seek out the next step and truly make this power your own. Trial of the True Body, 2225/100. Mash took a physical step back upon seeing the gains. He had eaten an egg, an unborn monster, and had gained 20 stats. Just what creature was it? Even his trial of the true body had progressed to 25. That was crazy. The improvements were unbelievable, and he couldn't help but try out the form. It took a second to figure out what he was trying to do, but Priscilla helped a lot. She had noticed that Mash had gained a new affinity and was able to guide his transformation with that in mind. The improvements had already justified the cost, but he could tell that there was more. He started the transformation, still not sure what the creature actually was. Fur grew all over his body, but it wasn't dense like the wolves. It was smooth, silky, and long. If not for his clothing, he was sure that it would be swaying in the wind. His hair had turned to the fur and was doing exactly that. Even without a mirror, he could see himself in his domain, but he wasn't able to understand things like color. So, he pulled out one of his mirrors to check what changes were happening to his face. A few things surprised him immediately. His features had narrowed noticeably. It was like his whole head had been pulled as tight as possible. His cheeks sunk in a little, and his nose stuck out a little more. His eyes had changed slightly. Instead of the black that usually surrounded his pupils, it had become yellow. Well, he would consider it closer to gold than yellow, but it was enough for him to kind of identify the monster. It was probably a fox or wolf of some kind. He was leaning toward a fox as his body had become significantly slenderer. The stranger aspect was that he didn't feel very different physically. His body had changed a lot, but he didn't feel any faster or stronger. It only affected your magic. Mash nodded. He had assumed as much and tried to manipulate the energy in his body. He didn't want to use any serious magic, so he simply tried moving the raw mana in the environment. He found that it came easier, almost as if the mana was responding to his mere thoughts. If that was the case, the form improved his control a lot. There was still something else to test. The new affinity. Priscilla always seemed to notice when his affinities improved or changed, though he didn't know how exactly. It probably had something to do with the fact that she had mixed with his core. Mash asked her what the affinity was. He was eager to play with it. What is the affinity? Heat and cold. She had chosen those words in particular. Mash assumed that it meant that it wasn't simple fire and ice, and something more complex. He felt Priscilla send her affirmation, and he wondered what the difference was. That was something she wasn't certain about, so he figured it was time to test it. Also, he should ask the others, as they were still in the process of watching him. Well, almost everyone was just watching him. Jill had teleported over and was touching his arms. He had been ignoring her thus far, but she looked like she wanted to say something. Can we shave you? This stuff feels better than silk. Mash's response was an empty stare. He did not care at all for the value of his fur. For that matter, he never considered what his forms could provide in a monetary sense. He wasn't planning on changing that anytime soon either. He had a scathing retort in mind but didn't get the chance to say it. Luke called out that the stew was finished, and Mash let his transformation slip away. He could test his new affinity after getting the disgusting feeling out of his mouth. Chapter 244, Temperature. The stew was good, and it gave Mash an opportunity to test his new affinity. He had a bowl of the stew in one of his hands and tried to focus on how hot it was. It was weird, but his new affinity gave him a better feeling for the temperature around him. He could also notice smaller changes in the temperature of the stew. As expected, it was dropping fairly quickly from the cold air outside. He wanted to raise the heat of just the stew. With a little help from Priscilla, he was surprised by how easy it was to change the temperature of something in his hand. His body was the source of the changes, it didn't look like he could do it remotely. The magic had to originate from his body. Thinking about it, he realized that all of his magic worked like that. It all originated from his body, but it didn't need to be like that. He decided it was probably for the best considering how he typically fought. His transformations naturally turned him into a close-range fighter, so he never really needed to cast magic from a huge distance. His fighting style wasn't likely to change, so learning a new way to use his magic wasn't really that important. The others had started eating the food, and Mash had received a fair bit of judgment for his decision with the egg. Red was telling him how eggs like that were usually valuable to beast tamers, or even just to raise a monster companion for battle. That was the typical use for monster eggs, but they all knew what he had planned even before he purchased it. Mash didn't care for the time and effort involved in raising a monster for battle. It was not worth the time or effort in his mind. He gained what the monster would be able to do with a lot less work. Plus, he trusted himself and, to an extent, Priscilla more than he would a random monster. Even if the monster had comparable intelligence to Priscilla, he doubted it would be able to foster the same mental connection. He noticed that some of the others were obviously feeling cold, and their food was probably turning similarly chilly. Realizing that he could help out, he warmed the space within his domain. Everyone was inside, though those closest to him felt the heat first. The snow melted around him and spread until an almost perfect circle formed around the group. The air was also warmer too. Jill was the closest to him, and she turned to him when the wave of heat struck her. She watched as the snow melted around her. It was easy to track the movement of the heat, as the snow melted as it rolled over the ground. Mash was surprised at how efficient the magic was. Even raising and maintaining the temperature was rather easy. It wasn't like he was trying to make it so hot that it burned anything, but he still expected it to use more energy. Especially with the otherwise freezing temperature of the place. Maybe the magic was just very efficient, but he could probably maintain this for hours if needed. Actually, he could probably do it indefinitely by making some imitations of Priscilla that would use the magic instead. His treant form let him make wooden imitations that would generate their own mana. He tried exactly that. First, he partially transformed his hand to become like the treant form, and then he proceeded to make a few imitations from them. Can you maintain the temperature? He probed Priscilla as she would be the one to micromanage the imitations. There was a lot more involved in his question, but he didn't need to send complex messages to get his ideas across. It was one of the advantages of having her in his mind. Yes, but if you want it continuously, you will need at least 10 imitations. Her response was along the lines of what he expected. She planned to set up a rotation so that the imitations would have time to recover their energy. It was a good idea, and he had enough energy to make the imitations. It did use a lot of energy, but he managed to make the imitations. Once he felt their magic fill the space, he dropped his own. It grew a little colder around him, but it was definitely still warm. Did you just get a fire attunement? Red's question surprised him a little. He wasn't really paying attention to the others and had just been focused on exploring his new magic. Shaking his head, he responded promptly. No, it's heat and cold. Not the same thing apparently. At least that was what Priscilla said. Red nodded and shared some more information. Yeah, it is something cooks would get. But how did you control the temperature so well? As far as I know, it should take months of training to control the range and temperature so accurately. Mash just shrugged his shoulders, he didn't really know how to respond to that. What was he supposed to say anyway? That it wasn't difficult, and he could just kind of watch what he was doing with his domain. It sounded like something arrogant, and he thought that it was mostly Priscilla's influence. In his mind, he could feel Priscilla protest. It is not, you simply have a talent for magic. I expect you would have made a good mage had you gone in that direction. Another comment he didn't really respond to. He was happy with the direction of his class and didn't think he would change it even given the chance. The way he fought was thrilling and just plain fun. He couldn't imagine standing in the back and using magic while being protected. Mages were also about preparation and patience. He wasn't very good at that kind of thing either. It was probably something he should get better at, but he had other things he could do to improve himself. Like gaining new magic that would help cover his weaknesses. Although the heat wasn't really one of those affinities. It didn't really cover any of his weaknesses, but it would provide another avenue for attack. Is there a trick to it? I can't really do anything fancy with my magic. Jill looked hopeful as she looked at Mash. She was probably hoping that there was a trick he was using. He shook his head and saw her excitement dwindle. Well, he couldn't magically change reality and he didn't have her affinities either way. He said as much too. No, but I also don't know what your magic is even like. I bet it's more complicated than what I'm doing. We could test it, right? I mean if you eat my hair or something, wouldn't you gain my affinity? Jill asked the question, that he had been avoiding. Although he hadn't been considering something mundane like hair. His mind had gone to eating someone, another human being. That just felt wrong, and he still didn't want to do it. Honestly, he didn't really want to even think about the idea. Reluctantly, he replied truthfully. I don't know, but I don't want to eat people. Jill was fast with her retort though. It seemed like she wanted him to test the theory. She didn't care about sharing her magic with him, and he could see that everyone was watching with curiosity. We could at least test it. And you ate the demons before, right? She cut some hair as she spoke and handed it to Mash. The idea of just eating a person's hair was kind of nasty. However, Jill's hair had changed from her advancements. It was always unnaturally perfect. Even after she had cut a little, it looked unchanged. The cut hair shone faintly with a golden light, and Mash reluctantly grabbed a single strand. The amount shouldn't matter for gaining the affinity. He didn't know if quantity had a correlation with strength, but it didn't seem like it did. Frowning, he put the piece of hair in his mouth and swallowed it with a mouthful of water. It felt bad, but it wasn't the worst thing he had ever eaten. Nothing happened, and he sighed in relief. He responded quickly, not needing Priscilla's confirmation. There had been no change, not even in his stats, and he knew that it didn't work. Nothing. I didn't get a thing. He was cut short as both Jill and Priscilla suggested something else. You should have gained stats even if you didn't gain an affinity. You need to try eating something else. Well, I didn't really think hair would work. You probably need skin or something. Mash hated that they were in sync. He secretly knew that something was up when his stats hadn't changed, but he had been ignoring that detail. It didn't escape Priscilla's notice, and it seemed like Jill just wanted to press the subject. She seemed eager, and Mash knew why. If he could siphon skills or affinities from people, then there were a lot of new avenues for power. It was a moral dilemma and one that would be considered taboo or illegal. Jill didn't seem to care, and neither did the others for that matter. The only other person that looked uncomfortable with the idea was Sarah. Luke, even you? Do you really think this is a good idea? His shoulders raised and fell. Not really that big a deal. I can easily restore whatever you do. And it would be good, though you should probably start with me. It would be nice to have someone else who can heal. Mash almost couldn't believe what he was hearing. Luke was supposed to be the most morally grounded of them. Was it really not that bad? Was he just overthinking it? With how nonchalant the others were being, it certainly seemed like he was being needlessly concerned. Why did he care anyway? He wasn't a human anymore. He really didn't think so, but he couldn't help but doubt himself. Luke's agreement with Jill really shook what Mash thought. With great hesitation, he agreed. Fine, we can try it. The words felt wrong even as he said them. They made him feel kind of disgusting, but he would at least give it a shot. It couldn't be that bad, right? With the words spoken, Luke walked over. He rolled up one of his sleeves. It was warm enough now that he wouldn't be bothered by the cold. Was he planning on letting Mash just take a bite out of it? Nope, that was not something he was willing to do. Nope. If I'm doing this, just cut off a bit of skin from your hand or something. Luke didn't say anything but opened his storage and grabbed a knife. Without any hesitation, he cut off a small piece of skin from his thumb. He healed it after and handed Mash the piece of skin. Mash's hands shook a little as he grabbed the piece. It was softer than Mash's own skin. He stopped thinking about it that way. That would only make the situation worse. Without thinking about it, he popped the small piece in his mouth and tried to swallow it like a pill. Instead, he was overwhelmed with disgust, and couldn't bring himself to swallow. The piece of flesh felt like any other piece of meat in his mouth. However, he was disgusted by the mere thought of it, resting on his tongue. He knew he was going to vomit. Trying to stop it, he used magic to fill his mouth with water and pushed the piece of flesh down his throat. It was a forceful method, but it got the piece down. He felt his stats increase a little. The rush of power was familiar, but it was overtaken by a shudder. Then he bent over and vomited on the ground. The piece of flesh didn't come back up, only water and spit poured from his mouth. He didn't really care, and just continued to vomit. Luke, who had been nearby, put a comforting hand on his back and started smacking him gently. Eventually, he stopped and asked Priscilla the more pressing question. Well, did we get an affinity? Chapter 245, Nourishment. Mash waited for Priscilla to tell him if he got a new affinity. The anxiety was making him sweat. Even if they were still in the cold, he would probably be sweating. Only a few seconds had passed, but he had to endure each one. You got an affinity for soul magic, though a minor one. When he finally got the message, he didn't know what to think. While that could be useful, he would have expected more from Luke. It wasn't that he wanted to be able to steal all of Luke's skills, but it felt like his skills should have given more. Instead, he had gotten something mundane. He didn't think he could use it to heal either. Maybe he could, he did have a life affinity. He never did figure out where he got it, but he had one. Maybe he could try some things now that he had access to soul magic. Mash looked toward the others who were watching him with anticipation. He wondered what result they were hoping for. He spoke clearly, making sure not to misrepresent anything. I gained a small affinity for soul magic, nothing else. He repeated Priscilla's words. It was a strange situation. He had gained something, but it hadn't been anything substantial. What do you mean by small? Luke asked the question. Mash opened his mouth and closed it, unsure of what exactly that meant. Mash turned the question to Priscilla. He sent her the message, but she was already giving him a response. The way they communicated was strange at times, it felt like he was talking to himself. Then magically, he would learn something new. He knew that didn't make any sense, but he couldn't think about it any other way. It still took almost a full minute to get all of the information. Priscilla said that it means that I won't be able to do very much with it. There was stuff about affinities, but essentially it just means that it would be harder to use my energy for that kind of magic. She gave me a few theories as to why this happened too. She thinks that Luke might just have a poor affinity for it, and he uses his skills to compensate. The other possibility was that Mash's own core was reaching its limit. She said that probably wasn't true considering how he had gained the heat affinity without a problem. He told them almost everything Priscilla had said. There were a few things that she had transmitted that seemed a little blunt and unnecessary. Things about Luke's possible talent, and so on. Mash hoped that there wasn't a correlation with talent. Mash hoped that his explanation would dissuade any further tests along this line, but he saw that he wasn't going to be so lucky. Red had walked closer while he was talking to Priscilla. She held something out to him, and he could tell what it was. A piece of flesh. Mash looked at her for a second, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. You can't be serious. Red gave him a flat look before responding. Mash, we aren't forcing you to do anything. If you really didn't want to, you wouldn't. You are just as curious as the rest of us, whatever the results might mean. Honestly, we should have tested this before. Mash grimaced but nodded. She was right. He wanted to test the bounds of his skills too. As much as ethics was a convenient excuse to use, it was a hollow rebuttal. There was nothing forcing, and for all his protesting, he would have done this eventually. He grabbed the piece of flesh but paused before putting it in his mouth. He made a wooden mouth on his hand, one that lacked a tongue or throat. That was something he should have remembered before. It was literally the skill he used most frequently. You forgot, didn't you? Red made the comment as she watched the wooden mouth devour the small piece of her skin. Mash looked down and made sure not to meet her eyes. In fact, he might just keep his head down for the rest of the night. There was another rush of stats. It was noticeably smaller this time. That probably meant there was a correlation with the person's stats. He waited for Priscilla to find the affinity. She found something quickly, though it wasn't what he expected. It is an ethereal affinity. It too is not very powerful but is better than the previous. Mash shook his head a little. He didn't even have the foggiest idea of what she meant. Plus, that second part sounded like a dig at Luke. Mash had more important things to talk about but made sure that she knew that she was being too blunt. What do you mean by ethereal? It is the best word for it I could find in your memories. He had been wondering how she came up with the right names for the affinity, but now he understood. She was looking through his memory and coming up with words that would make sense to him. Well, it seemed like she had missed the mark this time. He had absolutely no idea what she meant by ethereal. Try describing the affinity. There was a pause. It was long enough that he told the others it would take a second. That confused them, but they sat down and continued to eat their food. All but Jill, who held a knife in one of her hands. She was probably preparing to copy what the others had done. Although she was waiting to see what he said. He had nothing to do but wait for a response. So, he walked over and grabbed a new bowl of stew. Even though he had only vomited water, it had still made his stomach feel empty. He needed to fill it again. There was some difficulty to it, and he tried not to think about all of the things he had eaten in the day. He tried to focus on the stew itself. It was pretty good, but he couldn't stop himself from thinking of more disturbing meals. Although he did manage to avoid throwing up. It is like those strange mana creatures from before. Monsters that both do and don't exist in this realm. He wasn't really startled by Priscilla's message. Just as she could look through his mind, he could do the same if he tried. He had been doing exactly that. He hoped that it would let him get a better understanding of her thoughts. It proved quite effective, and he kind of understood what she meant. The more he tried to understand her intentions, the closer he got to the right word. Then it hit him, and he said the word aloud. Spirits? You mean spirits? The realization hit him, and he unintentionally shouted the words. The others had heard him. Mash paused and tried to explain to both Priscilla and the others simultaneously. It was surprisingly difficult to send Priscilla his thoughts while communicating them at the same time. I got a spirit affinity. But wait, why did I get that? His comment made everyone turn their heads toward Red. She did not have spirit-related magic, or at least not that she knew of. They were all thinking about the question. Red came up with the answer, her words breaking the silence. It's blood. I mean bloodlines or maybe race if you want to take it that way. Beastman, or rather Luke, was born with an affinity for the magic. I am a half-elf. Elves tend to use spirit magic. So, Mash doesn't get what people have earned, but what they're born with. Jill spoke, but still cut a small piece of skin from her hand. If what Red said was the truth, that would mean that Jill's flesh would probably not do anything for him. Wait, you didn't need to do that, right? I mean we're both just human. Jill shrugged her shoulders, responding nonchalantly as she tossed the piece of skin to him. Mash didn't catch it, but let a wooden limb pluck it from the ground. She replied before his wooden creation reached it. We need to test it still. My family doesn't have anything fancy to it, so you shouldn't gain anything. He guessed that made sense. The wooden hand that was about to grab the piece of skin turned into a mouth. It devoured the piece in one bite, and Mash felt the usual rush of stats. Priscilla confirmed their theory, and Mash was glad to share as much with the others. You were right. I didn't gain any affinities. I don't know if it's race or blood or whatever. I think it might be because the class system is something external. Well, it doesn't really matter. Mash was more than satisfied with the information. It meant that he wouldn't have to eat other humans. That was kind of unfair to the other less human races, but he just didn't mind as much. Demons were barely humanoid, and he knew that there were probably plenty of monsters like Priscilla too. He wasn't bothered about eating things like that, and he knew that humans weren't any different really. However, his thinking wasn't rational, nor did he want it to be. People were never meant to be logical, regardless of what some might believe. He wanted to do a little dance or something, but something else drew his attention. In all of the excitement with the whole affinity thing, it seemed like Sarah had taken the opportunity to leave. He checked his domain and even looked around. She was nowhere to be found. Where did Sarah go? The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular. Normally, he would be the one in charge of watching something, but it hadn't really been a priority. Maybe he should have kept an eye on her, but she felt weak. Not to mention she was terrified of him. She was probably waiting for a good chance to flee. Well, he wasn't planning on chasing her down. Jill raised a hand and lazily pointed in a direction. Mash turned to look where she was pointing but didn't see anything. He didn't even see any signs of footprints on the snow. He was about to ask her what she saw, but Jill spoke before he could ask. She went that way, probably heading to her secret base or something. I'm guessing she's been here for a while. At least I hope so. That pelt cape thing would be very weird otherwise. Mash wondered how Jill knew but guessed that she had put a mark on her. No one commented on the remark about the wolf head cloak. Honestly, Mash had thought it was pretty cool. It might not have been fashionable, but it was an interesting item in a practical sense. The wolf fur was strong and dense and would let her blend into the snow easily. Not to mention that it probably helped her disguise herself from other wolves. Ultimately, they didn't really care about Sarah. None of them got up or did anything with the information either. There was no point in following her. If it ended up being a poor decision, then they would deal with it then. Even if they wanted to be cautious of the girl, they wouldn't do anything like imprison her. There was a large gap between being cautious and hunting her down for running away. They weren't going to murder some random girl because of the chance of danger later. There was another reason not to care though. Simply put, they weren't planning on sleeping here. Time to head back. Luke spoke, a yawn escaping his lips as he did. Mash wasn't really sleepy. His hibernation and reconstruction skills healed things like fatigue. That wasn't true for the others though. Although Red didn't look very tired either. Mash wasn't entirely sure if she slept anymore, but she acted like she still did. At least she had done that so far. It wasn't his place to interfere. Mash finished cleaning pretty quickly and left the imitations of Priscilla to scurry around and try and find Sarah. He didn't think they would succeed, but it was the least he could do. With that out of the way, Jill teleported them all back to his brother's house. Chapter 246, Potential. It was fairly late when they arrived. Jill had teleported them into the training area directly. His brother was the only one awake at the time, and he had checked on them once they arrived. They talked a little about what had happened, and Mash mentioned what they had done to test his skills out. The others immediately went to bed, but he spent some time with his brother working on his new affinity. His brother used ice magic and Mash was able to practice freezing things with his magic. It was a little different than how his brother's magic worked, but he managed to freeze a couple of things. The affinity was weird, and he found it a lot easier to heat things up. After a little over an hour, his brother left to get some sleep. Mash still wasn't tired and continued to mess around with his new affinities. He even tried doing things with his spirit affinity. The soul affinity sounded like it could be risky to just try, so he decided to test the spirit one out. He didn't know what to expect but hoped that Priscilla could help guide him. That proved to be an effort in futility. No matter what he tried or what Priscilla suggested, he just couldn't make anything happen. It was like his energy refused to react to the affinity in the slightest. It wasn't a matter of quantity or quality. No, it just felt like he was missing something. There was some requirement for the magic, and it was something he apparently didn't meet. Was it his race? Red suggested that elves were the only ones that could do it, and he didn't think he was an elf. He had an idea but wanted to make sure no one was around. His head swiveled in a full circle. He repeated the motion and made absolutely certain of his privacy. Then he transformed. It wasn't a big transformation, but he tried changing to become a half-elf. He probably couldn't become a normal elf, but he should be able to do this. Not much changed about him. He may have shrunk an inch or so and his ears might have become slightly more pointed, but he didn't notice any other changes. Mash checked in with Priscilla too. Did the affinity improve? It did, but it was an insignificant improvement. Her message came flatly like she was somewhat bored. It was as if she expected it. How could she know? As he thought about the question, her answer appeared in his mind. Unlike the message, this was a more direct thought. She simply believed that his species was inherently worse at utilizing mana. Even if Mash was talented, it wouldn't have amounted to anything without the class. They were reliant on it for all of their abilities. Mash had his own thoughts on the matter. One that was prefaced by the fact that he had beat her despite having far less time or experience. That is because of your ability and talent. Not the class system. I suspect you would have managed with any avenue. Mash was unprepared for the genuine compliment. Priscilla didn't really lie to him, and she was blunt when conveying information. Praise like that from her would be her literal perception. He felt a little more confident now and tried again with the magic. Nothing changed. The minor improvement in the affinity didn't really help him with the magic. However, it did make him wonder what it meant to have an affinity. Can you use magic without an affinity? He received a reply as soon as he asked the question. Yes, but only a specific kind. Mana itself is an affinity, one that all creatures possess, though it may be small in some. However, anyone could accomplish simple things like moving the ambient mana in the air. To change the properties of mana requires an affinity. He thought about what she said but knew that there was a contradiction in there. In the past, Priscilla had suggested that she could do more magic than what she had an affinity for. Not to mention that he knew that there were mages long before the class system had been created. There had to be a way to bypass affinities. There is, but it is not reasonable. It is a matter of understanding and alteration. For example, I know how to perform fire magic despite lacking the affinity. Fire and lightning magic is similar in the way that mana is manipulated to perform them. I manipulate my own affinity to emulate that of another. That was what he was hoping for. He had known about his life affinity for a while, but he hadn't yet tested it. After the flesh thing that had formed within the orb that Daniel had given him, he was hesitant. The life affinity wasn't dangerous, but he didn't want to create anything that he would need to kill. Or worse yet, something that just died as soon as it came to life. He shivered remembering how he had given life to the flesh when he learned of the affinity. It would remain a nightmare within his mind. He tried to ignore it as he sent Priscilla another message. Does that mean I could heal with my life affinity? They discussed it for a little while, and Mash learned that the affinity was different from what he was thinking. When Priscilla and Daniel had said life, they meant it in a literal sense. His magic was all touched by his affinity. His wooden creations, the imitations, and even his forms were made alive through his magic. They were connected to his life and gained one of their own. Even if it was hard to tell sometimes. Did all humans have the affinity? Was it something he gained when his race changed? The conversation ended with a rather firm belief that he couldn't heal with it. Although he could try giving his imitations more life or making them of things other than just Priscilla. That sounded like it shouldn't be too difficult, and he tried making an imitation of himself. He couldn't make it as accurate as the ones of Priscilla. The wood simply didn't have the right color or texture. His wood was naturally scaled now, which helped when he was copying Priscilla, but it made his human replica distinctly inhuman. Mash's wood had slowly changed with each of his advancements, and now it was entirely scaled. It still felt like wood, but it was black, and the bark overlapped itself, making the scales look more real. Thus, the imitation that he had made of himself looked nothing like him. The problem was that it didn't look like any of his forms either. There was a surprising amount of detail on the imitation, but it was of his human body. When he transformed, his body changed to become very human. Plus, he couldn't replicate the clothes right either. He made sure to give it clothing, but it just made it look blocky. Well, the appearance didn't really matter. He was trying to impart it with life, whatever that meant. Mash tried to comprehend what life magic was, but he didn't know how to apply it practically. Priscilla gave him a good explanation, but what did it mean to give life to something? He didn't really know what else to do. He could control it with some effort, but that wasn't exactly what he would call life. This was just a puppet. What was the next step? How did he make it more like the imitations of Priscilla? How do you usually control the imitations? Actually, how do you control your bodies? Mash decided asking Priscilla was the best method for this. The bodies I create with the capacity for replacing my own. That way, if even a single body lives, I will survive. I can tell that is not what you want. As for the wooden imitations, I simply connect them with mental mana. Your skills unconsciously do that when you alter your body or grow additional limbs. Priscilla was really a fountain of information. He would bet that her understanding of magic was far greater than anyone in his world. Or at least among the very best. It was something to take note of. He wondered what it would be like if he spent years just working with her knowledge. It would probably take him a while to learn everything she had to teach, but it also wasn't necessary. She provided him with the relevant information when he needed it, and he could ask her for specific things when doing his own tests. He would gradually build on the knowledge that she could offer. Decades to understand everything. You greatly underestimate my age. Her comment was surprising. He knew that she had lived a long time and assumed that she had lived for hundreds of years. It seemed like his scale was too small. Mash couldn't help but ask. Why did you join with me? Aren't you stronger? The question hovered on the edge of his thoughts whenever he thought about what exactly Priscilla was. Mash bet that she would probably be considered a legendary monster like a dragon. Even if her power didn't match with those beings. Mash didn't doubt that there was something restricting her when they fought in that dungeon. Nor did he doubt that she could have won that fight if she had really wanted to. You were given a mark by a being that would not even acknowledge me. I had lived upon those beings back for ages and yet could never hope to earn anything from it. Even my long life was nothing to the world carrier. Yet, you who had lived an even smaller amount of time had earned not one, but two of those marks. I joined with you to gain a taste of their power. I wanted to understand what made them so great. Mash listened, trusting that she would be direct with her words. She was not the type to hide her intentions. This was no different, and she continued with her blunt words. Truthfully, I expected you to die. Even if you had lived for hundreds of years, it would mean little to me if I could glimpse a path to further evolution. Perhaps you will absorb me at some point. It was a risk, but one I took to break the cycle that had trapped me. Nothing would have come from me remaining in my own world. I was already at the apex, only the world carrier was above me. That was an insurmountable gap to me before. That is why I choose to join with you. Priscilla hesitated slightly as she sent the messages. He wasn't sure why she had chosen to reveal so much, but it made him feel better. The honesty was something he had wanted. Even if she revealed that she hadn't really cared for him. As she shared more, he felt his confidence rebuilding. For the first time, I am unsure. If you die, I might also die. Though it may be that I will simply transfer to one of my other bodies. This pressure of death was something that I had lacked. I am unsure if it is beneficial. However, I have already gained more than I would have expected. The many affinities you have taken, I have gained as well. That alone would have taken me thousands of years to develop. Even your envious talent is benefiting me. Whether I live or die, I would not forget the human that had granted me so much. Mash was stunned by her words. His response froze on his tongue. He was going to thank her for the honesty, but that felt inappropriate. Instead, he committed the words to memory. Mash's dwindling confidence had been bolstered. The words reminded him just how much time he still had left. Although it was not a reminder to take things slowly but to continue with confidence. It felt like she was encouraging him to do more. He placed his hands on the wooden replica of his own body and imagined connecting to it as if it was another limb. Its arm moved smoothly, naturally, and landed gently on his shoulder. The connection had formed. Chapter 247, Nothing Simple. Mash screamed as he woke up. Horrific monstrosities with the vague shape of men surrounded him. He sat up and prepared to fight. The scream died down, as he recognized his own creations. All were made of his wood, which did make them look like proper monsters. There were half a dozen of them too, and none had hump faces. He had been thinking of his many forms as he made them. One had a beak that resembled Priscilla's. Two had dragonoid heads and their arms were larger and had claws. Two had wolf-shaped heads and the wood was shaped to give them bigger muscles. That was probably pointless considering it was made of wood. The final one was the replica of himself that he had made at the beginning. The training had gone well. At the start, he hadn't been able to do anything, but he soon got to the point where he could control them like additional limbs. Naturally, that had been annoying and complex and was too distracting to use in a fight. Finally, he tried to emulate Priscilla more directly. She had near-perfect control of her imitations regardless of distance. She could even treat them like they had their own intelligence and leave them to complete tasks based on commands. That was what he really wanted to do. He had kind of succeeded. He figured out how to make them receptive to commands, though it was still pretty taxing. It had to do with mental mana. He needed to mix it in with his creation, which turned out to be horribly inefficient when he tried to do it outside of skill. That was the advantage of making imitations of Priscilla. When he did that, he was literally using his Thunderwood imitation. Using a skill turned out to be more efficient than using his affinities to replicate the effects. It was a bit of disappointment as he wouldn't be leading an army of clones into battle anytime soon. Honestly, just making a single imitation of himself that functioned like the skill was annoying. It felt like he was literally imparting his own mental capacity into the imitation. That made the process annoying, but not impossible. His mind simply couldn't handle more than 1 or 2 imitations max. Even Priscilla would struggle to control something like it. She was familiar with the imitations of herself, but she would need to focus more on more complex creations. Mash would have an easier time than she, which wasn't very reassuring. The best he had managed last night was giving 2 of them very simple commands to defend him while he slept. The beaked one that had been staring at him when he awoke was one of the 2 that got the command. The other was an identical replica of himself. He wondered why the others had moved around him. It was probably something he did, but he couldn't remember. It was creepy. He moved away from the assortment of wooden sculptures. 2 followed him, and he flinched a little as they moved within his domain. That would take some more getting used to. Mash wondered what the time was. He was still in the training area, which was several feet underground. He had no way of knowing what it was like outside. He heard a scream from the room's entrance. His sister had come down the stairs. Luna had been calling for him but started screaming when she saw the imitations. She was not alone either, and his brother jumped in front of Luna. His blade formed from the air. The air in the room instantly grew cold. Mash's eyes went wide as the 2 imitations which could follow his commands ran at his brother. They were surprisingly fast and lightning began sparking out of their body. "Stop!" Mash shouted the word. He controlled the imitations with his mind, but saying the words made it easier to direct his commands. The statues froze in place. One was in the middle of taking a step, its leg was awkwardly raised in the air. With how scary the imitations looked, the scene became quite comical when they froze up like that. His brother was too fast with his attack though, and both statues were frozen in place. Ice crawled up them, spreading from where he had swung his sword. It had spread out from the swing, freezing the ground in front of him too. Arthur had heard Mash's yell, and his expression grew darker. That wasn't the right way to put it. His brother was his usual stoic self, but the way his eyes examined the arena revealed how he was really feeling. I can see that you had an eventful night. The flat tone didn't bother him in the slightest. Mash replied easily, smirking a bit like a fool. For the first time in a long time, Mash felt genuinely good. It wasn't like the past had changed at all, but he just felt better. There wasn't any logic behind it, but his time spent with Priscilla had helped him regain some of his confidence. Yeah, that's one way to describe it. His siblings walked into the arena, staring at the sculptures with some curiosity. Naturally, they forced a better explanation out of Mash, and he was happy to display his new skills. The explanation took a while, and he found it easier just to show him. It turned into a much bigger display as he went through his other skills. They kept at it for a while, well into the mid-morning when the others got up. At some point, they had joined him and were watching as he controlled two replicas of himself. He was commanding with simple orders, like having them run in circles. After a short while, he finished playing with his skills. The others had fought the wooden monstrosities near the end. They weren't strong enough to withstand that, and he ended up with an arena filled with rubble. It would eventually get cleaned, but none of them wanted to be the ones to do it. They planned on heading back to the snowfield as soon as they could, but his brother stopped them. He apparently had something important to share. Arthur took a deep breath, his gaze washed over their group before he shared. I have told the king and church that Luke had become a demigod. I'm sorry. I know it wasn't my place to reveal that. Mash was surprised. His brother wasn't one to reveal information easily. There must be some reason behind the decision. The apology was directed at Luke, who shook his head and responded quickly. It's not a big deal, but what happened? Arthur nodded at Luke, and that seemed like all was settled. Then his brother began giving more context to the situation. His brother wasn't the type to give excuses even if they were justifiable at times. I was confronted by several people who had felt a divine presence enter the city. That was how they referred to it. Somehow, they were able to discern roughly where it was. Luna was willing to lie and say that it was her, but I decided that would cause more problems. I revealed Luke's class to stop any further investigation since it could lead to them discovering Jill's class. It was a reasonable explanation, although Mash didn't understand what he meant by divine presence. Mash couldn't feel anything with his domain. His brother had stressed the words in a way that indicated that he didn't really know either. Luke responded next, some hesitation was in his voice now. Is there something I need to do? Mash hadn't considered what would be required of Luke. Honestly, he kind of thought that nothing much would change. Well, he knew that something would be different, but he didn't think that it would be a big deal. The looks on his siblings' faces told Mash that there was probably going to be a lot for Luke to do. Yet, for one, I was told to bring you over when I saw you next. Though I can't really force you if you just want to do something else. Luna sounded a little annoyed as she spoke. She was not happy with being given such a job, and it was clear that she didn't really want to do it. As she kept going, her voice became a little hopeful as she tried to do the exact opposite of what she was supposed to. Sadly, Luke didn't give her the response that she wanted. No, I should do this. It is something I should have done before. What will you guys do? Luke turned the question to them. Red and Jill wouldn't want to go around visiting gods. The undead and the god killer were probably not going to receive a warm welcome. Mash guessed that they could go back north without Luke, though they would need to be more careful without the healing. We'll go visit my family. And by we, I mean me and Red. Jill had apparently had a plan that did not involve Mash. Although Red didn't look like she was aware either. There was no chance to protest though as they vanished. Mash stared at the place where they had been standing and sighed. I guess I'll come with you. Who knows, the gods might have something tasty to snack on. Mash would just go along with Luke. It wasn't like he had anything better to do. Plus, it would be cool if he could meet the gods too. He wanted to compare himself to them and see how close they were getting. You can't try to eat any of the gods. Arthur spoke, his tone was so flat that Mash almost took it as an accusation. Although his sister and Luke started to laugh, Mash realized that it was a joke. His brother's delivery had been way too genuine, but even he was grinning a little bit. His brother continued after the laughter died down. You will have to meet with the king as well. Mash almost expected another joke at his expense, but his brother wasn't Jill. The rest of the conversation went by with his sister telling Luke of all he would need to do. It was a long list, and Mash probably wouldn't stick around for all of it. Several of them involved extremely public displays of power. She was a healer too and had an idea for what Luke might be asked to do. The idea of sitting through all of that seemed boring. Although, he would still go to the temples. He wanted to meet a god and bet that this was probably his best opportunity to accomplish that. The morning training had left them somewhat dirty. That was doubly true for Mash, who had slept on a dirt floor. He went and got himself cleaned up. They also ate breakfast and just kind of relaxed for a little while. Luna had no desire to leave early, and they couldn't just leave without her. Eventually, his sister finished whatever she was doing, and they left. The city was slightly different now. The buildings looked newer, and there were no signs of the battle with the demons. Mash couldn't help but look for broken or damaged buildings or roads but saw nothing. The city seemed to have returned to normal. Children and other people strolled through the streets. The general bustle of the city surrounded them as they walked toward Jill's temple. Many people glanced at her as they passed. His sister wore casual clothing and would probably blend into the crowd if not for her paladin. Alex hovered around his sister, and she wore her resplendent armor. It was very distinct, and he wondered how his sister dealt with all the odd stares. Alex oddly watched over Luke as if to protect him too. He wondered if she had the skill to detect a god, or maybe she had just been informed ahead of time. The many stares and whispers annoyed him. He debated whether to find something else to do or stick with Luke. Chapter 248, Gods and Monsters. Mash, Jill, and Luke stepped into the guild. Only Alex didn't enter and instead stood at the entrance. This was the second time he had entered a place like this. His domain had changed since the last time, and now he could actually feel the god's domain before entering it. Mash wondered what change had caused that, but too much had happened for him to tell. He didn't think much of it and stepped into the domain without worry. Almost instantly, he felt it react to his presence. Unlike Luke and Luna, who were able to walk in without disturbing the domain, he entered like a rock thrown into a pond. The domain rippled, and the many paladins that were around moved. The reaction was so sudden, that Mash was only able to track everything because of his own domain. Almost 10 paladins had appeared, their weapons drawn. Some didn't use weapons and instead had a faint glow around their fingertips. All of them were looking at Mash. They didn't attack though. It was almost certainly because his sister was standing right next to him. It took a second for her to recognize what was happening, but Mash and Luke figured it out faster. Mash moved in front of Luna, and Luke did the same behind her. There were 3 paladins behind them and 7 were blocking the path forward. All 3 behind them had drawn swords, and Alex was among them. Even of the paladins in front, 4 were wielding swords and the others had no weapons in their hands. He wondered why there was so little variety to the weapons. Alex had her sword drawn, but it wasn't held to strike at them. She seemed more hesitant than the others. She was probably more worried about Luna than the others. That was somewhat comforting, although that still left 9 paladins to deal with. Mash wasn't sure if he could handle all of them in a fight, but he didn't want to fight them either. Well, he wanted to fight them but not in this situation. Each of the paladins felt close or above his level. He wondered how that was possible considering what it took for the level 100 advancement. Did gods have a way to get past those limits outside of the standard path? He expected that they must. He couldn't imagine priests or healers clearing dungeons, and he doubted that someone like his sister would kill someone for an advancement. These paladins didn't act like they had any reservations though. If his sister wasn't so close to him, he expected these paladins would have seen him dead already. Mash tried to figure out what was happening. What had he done? It had to be a detection skill of some kind, but he didn't know what had triggered it. As he thought about it, he considered the piece of flesh he had eaten from Jill. Even if he hadn't noticed any changes at the time, what if it made it seem like he was something similar? He really hoped that wasn't the case, because he would have had no way to explain the situation. The tense situation finally seemed to erupt, but not in the way anyone was expecting. His sister started to glow, and her mana filled the hallway. That wasn't quite right, it wasn't her mana. He could recognize her mana, and this was not it. Mash turned his head slightly to look at her. His sister's eyes were shining like small moons, and the air around her was sparkling. No, it was more like twinkling. She opened her mouth and spoke softly. It was not her voice, and the way it carried made him get a small idea of what was happening. He knew that one of her skills was communion with God and made the connection. Stop, you fools! He is no enemy. He is simply not human. Do not impede them. As the last word left his sister's mouth, the mana vanished. His sister stopped glowing, and she returned. She started falling forward, and Mash caught her easily. The experience was troubling. He wouldn't mind if his sister had willingly used the skill, but she seemed confused. Not to mention the marks of tiredness on her face. Well, he wouldn't blame the goddess too much this time. She had acted to end the fight and nothing else. Mash was glad to hear that it wasn't the piece of Jill's flesh that caused the problem. It was his race. That was a huge relief. The paladins had dropped to their knees, and every single one of them had their foreheads pressed against the ground. They still hadn't moved. Almost all of them hadn't moved. Alex was beside Luna. A golden light moved from her fingers into Luna's back. It was a healing skill or something to cure fatigue. Within a few seconds, Luna was standing on her own 2 feet. Her fatigue was gone now too. Luna acted as if nothing happened and continued forward after thanking both Mash and Alex. He wanted to ask her if she did that often, but it didn't seem like Luna wanted to talk about it. That plus the many gazes that he could feel on him made him avoid the conversation. He would ask her about it later, at the very least after leaving the temple. Luna led them into the building, along a hallway that seemed to wrap around the whole thing. In fact, the hallway seemed impossibly long, and it was dark. The inside of the building was illuminated by small rocks that looked like stars, and they grew more infrequent as they went deeper into the building. There was something strange about the temple. It was not that big on the outside, yet they had been walking for several minutes now. Mash felt Luna stop, and she rested a hand on Mash's shoulder. All of a sudden, the darkness seemed to vanish, and the hallway seemed to shrink. He could feel it shrink in his domain, and that confused him even more. The very space was shifting. It was kind of like Jill's skills but 100 times more complex. It bothered him a lot as he knew that there was nothing he could do to stop the shifting space. When everything stopped, he was left standing in a very normal hallway. A single large door sat just a couple of feet from his face. It was made of dark brown wood and had a white silver moon painted in the center. It had no knobs or handles, but it swung open slowly. There was a tension created by the creaking as it opened. The whole scene was far too dramatic, and he couldn't help but wonder if that was an intended design. Mash's opinion of the god was slowly falling further, though he was never really devoted. He never got the pull of it. Joining a temple was a limit, and once he had no intention of gaining. Plus, it would make it so that he was always beneath another person. At least that was what he thought 5 seconds ago. The door had swung fully open, and Mash saw the god. The god was not just another person, that much was obvious. Mash knew that people had the opportunity to meet their gods occasionally, but he was surprised at how little was shared. The goddess of the moon was not human. In fact, he didn't even know if calling them a goddess was accurate. Mash realized quickly that his eyes and his domain were giving him 2 very different representations of the god. His eyes saw what looked like an elf, but only in that, the person before them had pointed ears. That was where the similarities ended. The being had a genderless body, but one that was ostensibly large. To call them fat would be inaccurate, but neither were they skinny. Instead, they almost looked like they were wearing armor. But it wasn't armor. It was just their body. Their skin or maybe exoskeleton would be the more appropriate description here looked to be carved from stone. That was a much more accurate way of viewing the strange creature's body. Grey almost white stone seemed to be layered over their entire body and made the god into little more than an amateur's clay sculpture. Although Mash would be able to tell if it was something external. Well, he thought that he could see it with his domain. When he tried that he realized that there was nothing inside the stone thing, not anything resembling a living being. It was almost like it was just a puppet and nothing else. That made more sense than believing that this thing was a god. Even if the stone looked to have been plucked from the moon itself, he wouldn't believe that it was the goddess. The goddess was famous for her peerless beauty. While the stone was pretty, he bet that wasn't what people meant. As he stepped into the room fully, his domain revealed the truth. That stone thing was the god's body, though it was not her. Mash had seen mana around the statue but had just assumed that it was just a part of the puppet. The weird thing was shining, reflecting light just like a miniature moon, and so he knew that there would be mana around. It wasn't just the mana that caught his attention. He could trace the mana of the stone to another source. It was directly behind the statue, and Mash knew that it was the source of the light. He realized then what exactly the goddess of the moon was. It was a spirit. One that blended in perfectly with the mana of the room. Those fish things from the snowfields were already hard to discern, but this spirit was intentionally trying to hide from his vision now. It only entered his range when he stepped forward. It probably could have been hidden from his old domain, but his new one was able to notice the subtle touches of life coming from the ephemeral being. He saw the strange creature with his domain. At first, he didn't think it was very strong, but the mana it emitted was something else. The quality of the mana was what made it unique. The ambient mana he felt at night was more impure than what this creature was producing. He could feel it flowing into the stone being in front of him. His attention had already left that thing though, and he was focused on the small whitish woman. Her whole body was faint, and her skin was white and translucent. Everything about her was like that, including the dress that seemed to be a little too big. It was a simple dress that reminded him of something his mother would wear. The dress just seemed like a really long shirt on the small creature. She was beautiful in a way that wasn't unnatural. Unlike with simply high charisma, her appearance kind of fit with her visage. Long perfectly straight hair fell past even the dress. The god, it turned out, was not human. Then the god turned slightly. The real god, not the piece of stone that was visible to his eyes. It started looking around for a second but stopped when it realized that Mash was the one that could see it. The god moved forward, through the stone puppet and appeared in front of the creature. Her dress rippled as she moved, and Mash realized that the god was invisible to his eyes. He was only able to see it because of his domain. The two senses conflicted with each other. It felt like he was hallucinating. "You can see me. Your domain is not quite what I expected." The voice seemed to come from nothing, and Mash could tell that the others were confused by them. Rather, they weren't sure how to react to what was being said. However, the fact that the god was addressing Mash was clear. Well, this day was going to be filled with awkward conversations. That much was certain. Chapter 249, Elise the Moon Goddess. Mash was not sure how to respond to the god. There was a proper way of address that his sister had told him, but he was too stunned to think of it properly. The god's nature made his mind swirl a bit, and he found himself asking an odd question without much thought behind his words. It was more of a statement than a question, but he said it like a question. "You're not human." His tone explained that he wanted a response. Luna and Luke stared at Mash like he was crazy, but he was certain that they couldn't see the ephemeral being. Their focus was on the stone sculpture, the strange puppet that seemed to have been carved from moonstone. To them, it seemed like that was what he was looking at too. Although he was able to see the real nature of the god and was staring openly. It took a second, but the god responded without seeming to mind his informality. "I was human once but am not one any longer. I believe you are in the same situation. At least you can still be seen." That last comment didn't have the same mysticality as the rest of her speech. Thus far she had spoken like some kind of mystical entity that had to know more information than she should. It was the slight tinge of envy in her final statement that revealed her humanity. He was relieved to hear that she was once human. It meant that God wasn't just some random creature. The way she explained it, she couldn't do anything about her strange situation. Whatever she had become, it was something that inherently couldn't be seen by normal eyes. If she was using this weird puppet, that probably meant she couldn't make herself visible either. "Why did you get such a weird puppet?" His question earned him a glare look, while Luna just seemed confused by the situation. She didn't seem as tense as Luke, which made him think that she had met with the goddess more than once. He pictured his sister speaking to a statue while the real goddess hovered nearby. He just couldn't understand why the sculpture was so terrible. Did she want to make it seem like an abomination? It was too much work, nor am I talented at sculpting. That reasoning was surprisingly stupid. He wanted to ask why she hadn't just left it to someone else, but guessed that would have been pretty awkward for her. The goddess seemed a little childish, and he felt kind of bad for her. He didn't really know who a god could talk to casually, but imagined that a future god like Luke and his sister were good choices. Mash started at the stone abomination and felt some pity for the goddess. "I could probably fix that. Make it look like the real you. I mean." His sister decided that she was tired of being left out of the conversation and interjected herself into it. "What are you doing?" She stood and grabbed Mash's shoulder and started to shake him a little. She looked at him like he was a psychopath. He had assumed that she had been able to hear the conversation but didn't think so anymore. Mash was about to explain, but the goddess interrupted his sister. "Luna, I have been speaking to him. I will accept your offer, but you would need to pay reparations for failure." Mash looked at the moon fairy and raised an eyebrow at her. When she spoke to everyone's ears, her voice was slightly different. It regained that strange mysticality. He wondered why she was speaking more casually to him. Was it because he could actually see her? She made it sound like no one had been able to do that. That would probably make her feel pretty lonely, but then again, he might just be projecting. How much will I get if I succeed? He hadn't been planning on asking for remuneration but changed his mind once she brought up the cost. This sounded much more like a bet. She doubted his ability, but he knew that he could recreate her visage accurately. Well, Priscilla could, which was basically the same thing. His sister, who was still grabbing his shoulder, squeezed. She was probably trying to hurt him, but she didn't have enough strength to do that. Mash rolled his eyes at Luna. He wanted to explain how ridiculous she was being and share what the goddess really was. He did exactly that, using Priscilla to tell both Luke and Luna the truth. The goddess was a human at some point. A childish one at that. The statue looks nothing like her either. She is like this weird spirit next to the stone. Mash noticed the goddess's gaze focus on him and realized that she had probably sensed that. He was in her domain, so of course, she could tell when he was using magic. Despite having a domain himself, he was not used to hiding from one. I am open to human conversation, but refrain from insulting me if you would. Also, please do not spread the truth without my permission. The only reason I am willing to speak with you like this is your unique position. All of you are likely to walk a path similar to my own. She spoke with that formality that she had before. It was annoying to listen to and reminded him too much of Gerald. Can't you talk normally? And the reward was mostly a joke. It should only take a few seconds to make the puppet. Mash walked over to the stone statue. The goddess slowly drifted to his left to get out of the way. She stared at him carefully. He wasn't sure if he overstepped his bounds, but he felt like the goddess appreciated the casualness of his words. The goddess didn't feel cruel or anything. He felt a connection with her. They were both once humans. Even if he still looked like one, he wasn't, and eventually, people would come to know it. Honestly, after the incident at the entrance, rumors would probably start spreading already. Mash felt bad for the goddess who could not be seen by others. Sorry. It is a habit, I am unused to meeting those who would become like me. Mash didn't react. He was focused on the white stone that was in front of him. It was white and weirdly porous. Plus, it was emitting a gentle white light. The stone was probably pretty valuable, but he didn't think it mattered too much. For better or worse, he felt somewhat comfortable around the god. It was kind of like when he met Daniel. There was just something about her that made it seem okay. The situation was a little different than the one with Daniel though. For one, Mash could tell that he was weaker than the little moon fairy. The quality of her mana was suffocating and oppressive, and the only reason he could resist was his encounters with even more powerful beings. His domain still let him get an idea of just how powerful the goddess was. She might not have the physical strength to overpower him, he bet that she had plenty of ways around it. Although, he wasn't planning or preparing for a fight. Again, he felt weirdly comfortable around the goddess. Mash started working on the sculpture, cutting it into a white stone with a wooden blade. He needed to put some sharpness enchantments on it. The stone was harder than it looked. With all of the pores on the stone, he thought that it would be pretty soft. That was proved wrong, as he struggled to cut into it. Even with the enchantments, the stone still felt hard. It was like he was cutting through clay or something. Once he started, he couldn't stop. The horrified look on his sister's face was humorous. She looked like she wanted to yell or punch him, but she knew that it was too late to stop anything. As he cut the stone to better match the appearance of the fairy, he had Priscilla direct most of his movements. He physically moved his body, but she basically outlined the path his limbs should take. Ignoring his sister's pale face, Mash addressed the goddess again. By the way, what's your name, your human name, I mean. Also, I'm Mash. He spoke while continuing to cut the stone. It was a little awkward to introduce himself at this point in the conversation, but he still did it. The sound of the stone chipping wasn't very loud, but occasionally a big chunk of stone would fall off. The question had just popped into his head. There was something wrong about thinking about this person as only a goddess. She was human once and was obviously trying to find people who she could interact with normally. Mash wasn't the most perceptive person, but he could tell that she was lonely. The statue was coming along quickly. It was harder than he expected, and he slowed down significantly in his shaping of the stone. He knew that he could manage something half-decent with Priscilla's help, but this was turning out way better than he expected. He had been told once that he had some talent in art, but he never really believed it. Honestly, with how well he was doing, he wondered if the artistic skill was something he had picked up from one of the many things he had eaten. Maybe it was just Priscilla. Whenever he made wooden sculptures, he relied on her ability to project images into his mind. The goddess was watching him work and was hovering beside Luke and Luna. They were also watching him silently, but they seemed much more apprehensive of him. The fact that they weren't stopping him made him think that the goddess was stopping them. Mash had explained the situation through messages, but they didn't trust him at all. The goddess, who was carefully watching his progress, replied easily. My name was Elise. I guess it still is, but I do not know how many people would be willing to use it. She sounded sad yet hopeful. Sad for the forgotten name, but maybe it wouldn't stay forgotten. Mash didn't think he could just become friends with the goddess and doubted that he would see her very often. However, he would at least address her by name, even if that might bring more animosity. At this point, he doubted that many temples would like him very much. He continued to work on the statue, while he tried to talk about more mundane subjects. Mash asked about Luna and the temple. He asked why Elise had become a goddess. It turned out that it just kind of happened. She was offered the class and accepted it. The process was just that simple. Things like creating a temple or garnering followers were not something gods needed to do. The more Mash asked about the gods, the more subtle hints she gave about him becoming one. That naturally brought the discussion to the main topic. Luke and Luna had been worried the whole time, but they had relaxed a little as Mash talked with Elise. The simpleness of his conversation showed them that they didn't need to be so careful. They had interjected a few times, but now the conversation moved towards Luke. The only reason they had gotten this audience was to discuss Luke and not a sculpting session for Mash. Mash listened at first as they discussed what it meant to become a god, the responsibilities and the duties of the class. Also, he was surprised to hear that the class could level without killing monsters or people. It would open up new paths for levels much like his sister had. There was a large list of limitations though, and he idly worked as he listened. Chapter 250, Moon Power. The goddess, Elise, looked on as Mash finished his sculpting. On the other hand, Mash looked at his sculpture and thought that he had done a pretty good job. The statue had originally just been standing in the center of a pretty much empty room. It was also the only source of light for the room too. It was far more mysterious and ominous before. The strange, impossible to identify, piece of white stone made the god seem much more terrifying than what Mash had just finished. He had made a fairly accurate replica of Elise's real appearance. She was a fairy. A literal fairy, and even if he made the sculpture as big as a normal person, it still seemed cute. Even if her eyes seemed to contain full moons, they were large, and she had a youthful face. The wings and spring dress that Elise wore made her seem kind of like a noble child. Even if he used the full height of the child, the goddess still appeared young. Adding the final detail to the sculpture, it was as good as he was going to get. As far as recreation went, it was almost perfect. Priscilla's ability to recreate things was incredible, but he could do nothing to replicate the mystical nature of the goddess. Elise didn't mind, and she was smiling a little as she saw her new statue. Mash turned looking over the others. Luke and Luna stared at his creation, both had surprised expressions. Mash grinned proudly before speaking. I introduce the real Elise. A replica of her, that is. His sister stared at her statue. She spoke with some trepidation and her voice shook a little. She probably couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was drastically different from the previous statue after all. Would that cause problems when someone else entered? The goddess seemed happy, so he doubted it. That's the real goddess? Really? She sounded disbelieving, and he could understand why. For all of the goddess's beauty, she looked extremely young. If her age matched her appearance, she would be a little younger than Mash himself. Although, that was probably related to her race over anything else. He wasn't as worried about becoming an immortal anymore. Even if it happened at that very moment, then he would still look older than Elise. That was a vain thought. One that vanished when Elise spoke. Yes, it has been a long time since I had last seen my own form. Mash stumbled away from the statue as it began to move. Elise had moved into the statue, and it moved as she spoke. The puppet gained life as she entered it. A trick much like his imitations, but it was probably closer to the possession or something. It reminded him of ghost stories, and the suddenly animated nature of the weird statue surprised him. The mouth and eyes even imitated normal motions, but Mash didn't think the sculpture he made should have had that capability. He tried to understand what was happening. Looked through his domain and tried to follow any traces of mana. As he stared at the statue, he noticed how his vision didn't match what his domain was sensing. It took a second, but he realized that it must be an illusion, some kind of magic to make the statue appear like it was moving. It was a good trick and her magic breathed life into his sculpture. She smiled happily, but Mash was more focused on the magic she was using. It reminded him of his recent experiments. He had needed to blend 3 different types of magic to make the working imitations. Elisa's possession and imitations were even more complex. It was only 2 different types of magic, but each was extremely complex. The illusion was a single type of magic, light if he had to make a guess. However, it was the complex blend of the mana that was truly impressive. Color, size, shape, and movement were each handled perfectly. It didn't even seem like she was struggling in the slightest. Rather, she was just glad to have a body that didn't look like a monster anymore. He had to wonder why she hadn't done it sooner. There would certainly be other sculptors who could do better than him. Why didn't you get someone to do this before? The casual nature of their conversation made him feel like he could ask the question without worry. Elise didn't seem to mind, but her smile dwindled a little. The way it drooped so naturally was impressive. There had to be some kind of mental link with the illusion. I am invisible to any with such a class. Not many can see me. Even I cannot properly perceive my own body. I believe you and the king are the only ones in this kingdom with the ability. Many could feel my presence, but to get such an accurate sculpture would have been impossible. Also, not many would be willing to work with such valuable material. That final bit was said with a small smile. Mash wondered if it was a joke or something and raised an eyebrow. He had assumed that it was pretty expensive, but that didn't mean much. He had gold, and even if it was stone from the moon, it was just some stone. Although, he was curious enough to ask about it. How much exactly? Such a large piece of purified moonstone would be worth several million gold. Elise shrugged as she revealed the amount. Her smile hadn't changed, which made him think it was a joke at first. That changed when he noticed the expression on his sister's face though. Her normally flush features had become pale, the blood had drained from her face. Mash didn't want to believe it. Wait, you can't be serious, right? I mean, why would you just let me cut up something so valuable? Elise shrugged her shoulders. I could have secured more if needed, and you did suggest that you would pay for it had you failed. I would not have minded a favor from people with such grand futures. Despite attempting to be casual with her explanation, it came off as a much more manipulative and well-calculated maneuver than it probably was. It was probably true that she didn't care all that much. He doubted there were many things she actually needed gold for. Plus, she could probably get more of the stone too. The conversation didn't really have anywhere else to go. There were a few more words exchanged, but it ended with one statement from Elise. There is still the matter of the reward. Is there anything you would like? Elise spoke to Mash calmly, but she was obviously very curious. It seemed like she was expecting something from him. He had no idea what she wanted him to ask for. Maybe he should have thought more about what to ask, but he didn't hesitate in the slightest. Answers to some questions. He phrased his own response like a question. It might have been a blind hope, but he had so many things he wanted to ask. Elisa's expression changed, and she frowned a little bit. His response was clearly not what she wanted. Still, he knew that she would have access to so much information. Even if their conversation had been casual, he expected that she knew a lot of the secrets behind the class system. Her gaze drifted upward, and she raised one of her stone hands to her chin. She was still thinking about how to respond. Mash wasn't sure how it was going to go. Elise made it seem like this was the most annoying thing for him to ask. He could have asked for something simpler but had been told to absolutely not try and eat some of the goddess. While he didn't want to eat people, he wouldn't mind getting a small nibble of a god. He couldn't imagine what someone like her would give him. Just ask your questions, and we will see if I can answer them. I do know a little about you, and there are some things I can't say. Mash wondered who could impose rules on a god and only had one suspect in mind. That naturally led him to ask the most relevant question. Do you know the world owner? He had yet to find any clues on the being that owned this world. He assumed there was one but didn't actually know. Even if the goddess didn't know, he wanted some confirmation either way. I know of him, yes. However, I may not speak of him until you get past level 200. Elise's response did give Mash some validity for what he knew, but also brought up another plethora of questions. Why level 200? This question makes her glance to the side for the second. It was this gesture that made him think that she must have established a mental link with the puppet somehow. He looked at her, his gaze like a hopeful puppy. The information about classes above level 200 was non-existent. No one at the level shared anything. Not the names of skills or classes. This was the first time he had ever heard a real mention of the level. He wanted more information though. Elise smiled a little. This much should be fine. Level 200 requires more than just killing monsters or clearing dungeons. Once you get to 200, to actually advance is more complex than before. That is usually the final class people can get. You can keep leveling certainly, but you can't advance your class normally anymore. Once you get to 200, the advancements are a matter of quality. Mash ate up the information, committing it to his memory. Well, Priscilla committed it to her memory, which was basically the same thing. Elise was telling them a lot, and he was more than a little grateful for the information. Any hints on how to advance at that level would be huge, and an advantage that most would not have. He had to try and get more. What level are you? And is the quality like upgrading your skills? She shook her head slightly. It wasn't a normal rejection though. Her head bobbed at an odd angle as if he was partially right. I will not tell you my level, but it is above 250. Though there is not much to gain once you get this far. As for your second question, you are partially right. Altering your skills is possible and it might work. However, that will depend on you as well. You and your friends are on the right track, just keep going and you will eventually get there. That was some good confirmation to have, but he still wanted to know more. He was going to push for more but paused as she raised her hand. I can't say anything else. I'm sorry about that. Although, I think I have said enough. She wasn't going to give him the opportunity to dig for more information. Mash sighed but nodded. It seemed like they were out of time, and he knew better than to ask for too much. Honestly, he didn't really need or want any reward. He was just being opportunistic. The goddess was nice, and he liked her. He didn't want to put her in an awkward situation, and he was more than happy with the answers he already received. Luke and Luna seemed just as satisfied, although Luke's gaze was focused elsewhere. Mash wondered what he was looking at and felt some of Elise's mana hanging in front of Luke. A secret conversation between two gods? He wished he could listen in but settled for just saying his goodbyes.